Remember how I said I was done talking about Bloody Roar 4 after the retrospective? As it turns out, I'm a liar. Bloody Roar 4 was a mess of a game. I don't think that's news to most people watching this video, especially if you played the more broken North American or PAL versions. However, like a detective at the scene of a crime, I've always wanted to have a chance to dig a bit deeper and get a glimpse at what the earlier stages of development looked like. Thanks to a friend with some oddly specific connections, I was able to get my hands on and play around with a prototype build of Bloody Roar 4. You might ask how an even less finished version of a game that initially launched unfinished could reveal anything new about it, and to that I say, keep watching because you'd be surprised. Also, prototypes usually have some goofy looking bugs in them, and I am all about getting a cheap laugh or two from those. Let's go back in time first. E3 2003 took place from May 14th to May 16th in LA. A couple weeks after this, the kinda bizarre looking Bloody Roar Extreme Xbox release would hit North America, and 6 months later, Bloody Roar 4 would release in the West. The series had a minimal presence at E3 that year, outside of a couple trailers and an interview centered on BR4 plugging what would become the ill-conceived snooze fest that is career mode. The game also appeared as part of a Konami promo booklet distributed at E3, which reuses several assets from Primal Fury/Extreme. This may or may not have been foreshadowing. Around this time, a prototype build for Bloody Roar 4 was being put together, with it being quote-unquote finished on or around July 15th, 2003, and files within the build dating to May of 2003, around the same time that E3 was going on. Yes, the prototype you're about to see was the state of Bloody Roar 4 less than 4 months before its release in the US and Europe. And given the state it's in, it's no wonder why the Japanese release took another 6 months to happen. Given its early build nature, the prototype has a lot of incomplete features and points where the game will either lock up or crash entirely. Sorry to say, but the only cutscenes present are for the logos on startup. And even then, they're buried in the code and don't actually play. The in-game and ending cutscene data is straight up missing, and trying to play just about anything in the sound test menu will cause the game to freeze. However, most modes are playable, including Arachdi mode, so there's still a lot to explore and play around with. Some things in this build are minor and could be fixed relatively quickly, but others make it apparent how rushed key parts of the game were. As you might expect, some of the audio in the prototype consists of placeholders. Said placeholders are usually from Primal Fury/Extreme, with the most obvious example being the transition between stages. Assuming that it doesn't bug out. There's also the jingle for losing a match.
You lose! Game over!
And the menu sounds for career mode, though to be fair, those are from an even older Bloody Roar game. Upon checking the music section of the sound test, several tracks from Extreme were in the audio files. And upon digging through the audio data, Extreme's Japanese announcer has almost all his voice files present.
Bloody Roar Extreme! Yugo! Alice! Bakuryu! Get ready! Fight! KO!
What's also a bit odd is that the final game's announcer recorded this line.
Out of the ring!
There are no ringouts in 4. Or were there supposed to be, and they came up with the force field stuff for some tech-related reason? I'm not sure. Also,
mission succeeded. Mission failed.
I'm guessing these were supposed to be for career mode? I have no idea, but they don't get used. The Extreme track that plays over the animated cutscenes is present in the long-form audio files 17 times in a row. Presumably because they included it once for every character who had an ending cutscene, because they either didn't or couldn't have it on the disc once and reroute that one track to every character's ending. This extends to the sound effects as well, namely animal roars, like how the exact same wolf howl for Yugo appears 11 times. For the record, this repeating of audio files happens a lot in the files with the final version as well.
Beginner, 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 beginner.
Some of these audio files are in a format specifically used for GameCube games. So yes, it's a blatant copy-paste job of files that ultimately wouldn't appear in the game. Even the ones that aren't a blatant copy-paste have some oddities. Despite this audio overload, several sound effects are straight up missing. BR4's music tracks are present, but things like the victory jingle, a certain stage's music, and career mode's music are gone. Also on the music front, several BR4 tracks are on the disc, including one track that doesn't appear in the commercial releases. However, some tracks are missing certain instruments, usually synthesized pads or keyboards, or are mixed differently from the final versions. Oddly enough, I think this actually makes some of them sound better as a result.
Get ready, fight!
Something to note about the audio as a whole is, well, take a look at the waveform. Anyone with experience mixing audio is probably frothing at the mouth looking at this, because all these flat tops on the waves indicate parts where the audio is peaking or nearly peaking, which distorts the music or sound, meaning there's a chance whoever handled the engineering for this didn't know what they were doing, or they just recorded the sound at way too high of a level. And yes, this shows up a lot in the waveform for the final release as well. Several voice clips are assigned to the wrong actions. Characters will have several second-long lines assigned to regular kicks or punches, and as such they constantly get cut off. But one of the more blatant examples is Marvel screaming like she's entering Hyper Beast form when she's really just performing a throw. Most of the characters have their Japanese voices implemented, but some have no voices whatsoever. This despite the English voices for the characters being on the disc, and the game releasing in English-speaking countries several months before Japan. Speaking of, some characters have two different English voices in the same build, one for BR4 and the other from Extreme, but in the final version, for the newer characters' voice actors, their dialects and tone seem to change sometimes, as though they were still trying to figure out the characters as they were recording for them.
Sorry, Yo-Ho can't control himself. Does it hurt? You want me to lick it?
In addition, the English voices are in such a state that characters that would have effects on their voices, like Nagi possessed by the Unborn or Stun in general, just have normal voices.
It looks like I've been rescued by this vile body again. Yes, I guess there's nothing but to go on living in this body.
Quickly, wake up quickly and fight with me!
When trying out a few fights, it became apparent that many of the sound effects were also assigned to the wrong actions. This includes things like the sounds for guard attacks, beast drives, and leaving beast form. The audio quality varies from person to person at times, meaning they likely recorded different people with different equipment and in different locations. This wouldn't be too surprising given what I learned about how one of the VAs was cast for this game. It's just my opinion, but...
You speak English?
Yeah?
Come with me.
Okay? That probably seemed like a joke, but no, that's actually how one of the actors was recruited. As a result, some voices just sound worse than others, and some even have faint background pops, clicks, or what sounds like things dragging or getting placed on a desk.
What? You know about...
Finally. Maybe all...
That might explain why the vast majority of Bloody Roar 4 has music or background noise playing over the voices, to hide that part of the audio. I would know, I've done this a lot in my videos. It still doesn't hide things that happen when the actors speak though, like when Marvel's VA pops a P.
This isn't poison.
The final product of Bloody Roar 4 had several instances of voices either getting cut off or sped up to fit a scene, and after digging through the prototype, the normal speed, not cut off at all voices are in here.
What in the world do you have me fighting against? What in the world do you have me fighting against? What is that?
For getting you involved in such a dangerous event with no explanation. I'm really sorry. For getting you involved in such a dangerous event with no explanation. I'm really sorry.
More for my original body! More for my original body!
What? Now I'll have some real fun.
This makes it likely that instead of the VAs being given any approximate time or tempo for their lines, they were just told to talk slowly and their square pegs of dialogue were shoved into the round holes of the cutscenes. On top of all of that, despite how bad the final product's voice work was, there were multiple takes recorded for several characters, and many of those takes show up in the prototype. Maybe it's just me, but I found that some of them sounded better than the ones that made it into the game, which could be the result of having a person who's not a native level English speaker in charge of determining which takes to use.
You're an old fool. You're an old fool. You're an old fool. You're supposed to be strong. You're supposed to be strong. You're supposed to be strong.
It's apparent from these takes that some of the lines were written a bit differently at first, and it seems like adjustments were made on the fly by either the actors or whoever happened to be nearby at the time.
Sheena? John?
So my entire life has been controlled for this thing. So my entire life has been controlled for such foolishness.
It wasn't the work of that white zoanthrope. It wasn't the work of that white guy.
All the girlies say I'm pretty fly for a
White guy.
The final version has multiple takes for some voices too, which is not just a bit confusing, but also a waste of disk space. And lastly, some lines of dialogue are just straight up missing from the voice bank in the prototype. These lines do appear in the final version, but they're all crammed together at the end of the voice files in a random order, as if they realized those lines weren't there and rushed the actors back into whatever office meeting room they were recorded in.
Leave now while you still can.
Don't just leave me here! Oh!
Why, indeed?
One unusual thing about the prototype is who's in it. At a glance, some characters have different, likely unlocalized names like Ryoho here, but some have different beast names than what appeared in the final game. Uriko is called what she's always been called here, the half-beast, while the final version called her the cat. On the flip side, Shenlong has always been the tiger, but here he's called the clone. What's a clone in beast form terms? Is that like a ditto? There's something else odd here. Aside from none of the unlockable characters being, well, locked, one character is missing. Or should I say, half a character is missing. The Ryoho here is Dragon Ryoho, and his portrait's appearance changes in career mode, having what looks like a placeholder for a third eye on his head, and a far less constipated expression. Ryoho and Mana do appear as CPU opponents, but they can't be selected by the player in most modes, suggesting they may not be ready for play yet. They are a selectable option in the game's career mode, but Mana doesn't actually appear for the fight, and trying to go into beast form causes the game to lock up. Again, this build was from less than 4 months before release. Additionally, there are other characters found in the prototype's code that aren't playable. Perhaps you've heard of them: Fang, Ganesha, and Kronos. Yes, the coding for all 3 of these extreme characters is present in the prototype. Upon checking the final build of BR4, guess what? All 3 characters have coding in that version too. Between this and the heavy reuse of sounds, music, and character designs from Extreme, it's easier to make a case that BR4 is a port of Primal Fury than the old and blatantly wrong accusation of Primal Fury being a port of BR3, particularly for this build. Second and third costumes can't be selected for any character, but playing certain modes will usually force the opponent into their second costume. Well, usually it will. There was an awkward moment or two where there was a doppelganger match and both were in their default attire, suggesting either the second costumes weren't there, or they just hadn't programmed them to be used for that scenario. Then again, maybe they just weren't finished, though that didn't stop them from including Marvel's second costume, complete with see-through legs. Not sure how this happened from copy-pasting the model, but hey, I'm not a programmer. The camera has issues of its own, sometimes being in entirely wrong positions on victory screens, and certain transitions wait, hold on, what did that say? Now no make tanga. What's tanga? Okay, there's no way that's what it actually means in this context. The physics/collision detection can be a bit off at times, like how the game has no idea how to handle Gado's tail hitting the ground. Sidestepping against an opponent that's ducking causes them to rotate in place. Speaking of ducking, some characters will get really twitchy heads if they duck against certain opponents. This is a bit creepy, but still not as creepy as the broken blinking animation for the soulless eyes of Alice's beast form. Certain parts of the stages and even the main menu have out-of-place green coloring to them where visual effects are supposed to go. On that note, the visual effects for many characters' guard break moves and beast drives aren't in place yet. That's still better than not having other parts of beast drives in place, like how Long and Shenlong have a beast drive where the lighting effects miss their cue and then slowly fly by after it's finished. You might ask, what's so weird about that? Not much, but check out what happens when going back into beast form with Shenlong after performing that beast drive. He basically turns into Andross. Surely Long doesn't do the same thing, right? I mean, he technically doesn't. That beast drive was incomplete from a visual effects perspective, but one of Koryu's drives simply doesn't work yet. Not only does he not fire missiles, but he effectively turns the opponent into a lawn dart, one that can be pushed around the stage. What's funny is seeing the computer do this to someone and just standing around for the rest of the fight, as if to say, this is perfect. Why would I want to ruin this? One of Uriko's beast drives is even more broken, as instead of grabbing the opponent, turning into a ball and bouncing around the stage, the ball never forms and both of them vanish. The only ways out are to quit to the main menu or wait for the timer to run out. Still, the undisputed king, or should I say queen, of broken beast drives is a character that has been described as broken prior to this. Uranus. Both of her beast drives cause the game to crash so hard that it nukes the emulator. Well, there is a small chance one of them won't do this, but it still causes the game to freeze and fill the screen with code. The last game I saw that had this kind of problem for supers or finishers was Shadow War of Succession, which wound up cutting them from the game entirely. Yes, I just made that comparison. From getting to know how this version of the game plays, there are a few significant differences, both in the modes of play and certain mechanics. First of all, time attack and survival don't work yet. Time attack doesn't have a timer or a scoreboard, and survival doesn't keep score either. Sparring is a useless mode anyway, so it's not a big loss, but regardless of how many rounds I set the fights to, it always defaulted to 5, even though sparring isn't supposed to have rounds at all. And no matter who I selected as the opponent, the game would pick someone at random. That's on top of survival and sometimes Arachne mode, breaking and throwing out the same character 2 or 3 fights in a row. The beast gauge is handled quite differently, as here it only starts at about half full, or half empty if you want to be like that, and beast drives only take away about 1/3 of the beast gauge, but still revert the character to human form. While having the human health and beast gauge be completely independent health bars is still an awful idea, I do like this better than what we got in the final product. It helps that the damage scaling in the prototype is nowhere near as bad as in the eventual release. Human health still runs out too fast, but the beast gauge depletes much slower, both at the default setting and after cranking the damage values up, because it didn't seem like that option actually worked at this point. Arachne mode is otherwise the same, but with one major difference. Aside from this being the one place where Ryoho and Mana both show up, and at this stage Mana doesn't even have a KO animation, the dragon is still really easy to avoid. But waiting out the timer to win by having more health doesn't work, because for some dumb reason, the game calls it a draw regardless of who has more health. The prototype then initiates sudden death. Only the dragon still has all its health, and the player has none. Here's the baffling part though. You can continue if you lose to the dragon. Yes, this part originally worked as it should have, and then they broke it for the final version. I could go on a long tirade about that, but let's just go to career mode, or Ikusei mode as it's listed here. It has a pretty different approach. Just ignore the untranslated Yogoshu section. That's the glossary, which doesn't work, and in the final version of the game, it still doesn't help at all. Instead of the giant grid of spheres that's a pain in the ass to navigate, the player starts at one point and traverses a sideways pyramid structure where the fights go from hard at the bottom to easy at the top. The difficulty scaling isn't implemented here though, much like the final product where the fights were all pretty easy, save for certain parts of the Japanese version. Trying to enter this mode with certain characters will cause the game to freeze, but I was able to get it to work with Marvel and see more of how it worked. You move from the left of the pyramid to the right, and you can't move back to any previous spaces. You earn DNA points in random fights based on which space you move to. The first space yields 100 points, and this increases to 200, 400, and 700 points along the easy path, and 300, 600, and 1000 points along the hard path, with the middle spots being increasing increments of 100 in between. Upon reaching any of the pyramid's end spaces, the screen kicks back to the career mode menu and the pyramid resets so you can earn more points. And no, unlike in the final release, you do not earn less points at any point in this, because you're technically not selecting the same space more than once. Abilities seem to just unlock for finishing a fight rather than progressing to a certain point. And while abilities can be equipped, it doesn't say how many points each ability costs, so it turned into a guessing game trying to see what abilities I could afford. Unfortunately, after a fairly low amount of fights, abilities just stopped unlocking, probably because they hadn't been implemented yet. In fact, and perhaps unsurprisingly, most of the abilities just aren't here. Entire categories of abilities are missing, and I was specifically hoping to test the capture command abilities just to see how janky the animations looked, but they weren't in the prototype. My takeaway from all of this is that less than 4 months before the game's release, and despite it being specifically mentioned in interviews at E3, the developers still had no idea how career mode would be structured. And taking in the prototype as a whole, I'm even more convinced that Bloody Roar 4 was basically a middle school history project. A loose concept with a dash of plagiarism that had way too much of it thrown together as the deadline approached. No, I'm not speaking from past experience. Who said I was?